Welcome to Sensitivity Sessions, a podcast for highly sensitive people about appreciating your sensitivity and finding purpose as an HSP. I'm your host, Stephanie Gardner-Wright, a licensed psychotherapist and HSP consultant. On today's episode, we're talking about unlearning unhelpful and toxic beliefs that can keep us feeling dissatisfied and stuck in life. So, what is a toxic belief anyway? How do we define that? I think it's a little bit different for everyone and it's highly subjective. So, what feels like a toxic belief for some people may not feel toxic to others, but only you can know for sure if a belief is unhelpful and toxic to you. My definition of a toxic belief is anything that makes you feel shame about who you are, makes you feel less than other people, less than what your capacity has been in the past. If you're comparing yourself to past versions of you and coming up short, that is a toxic belief, in my opinion, or an effect, should I say, of a toxic belief. Or if you are feeling like you need to take up less space or silence your voice, those are all clues that there are some deep unconscious level beliefs that are operating and informing the way that you're living your life, how you're responding to other people, how you believe that you deserve to be treated. So these beliefs can be very insidious. They're not evil or bad beliefs usually at all on their own, but they can have really long ranging effects, ranging from how we conduct ourselves in relationships, how close we might allow ourselves to get to other people or not, and maybe how we show up in friendships, the workplace, and also what we believe that we deserve or what we believe that we can do. So maybe, for instance, you've had a passion for something for as long as you can remember, and you used to do that thing all the time when you were a kid. So maybe you did art and you like to draw all the time, and you're like, yes, this is great. I'm going to be an artist when I grow up. And as you got farther along, either in school or got feedback from friends and family, perhaps you started to feel like, oh, now I've been to some museums and I've seen world class masterpieces. I'm not up to that task. I can't create a piece of art that's Michelangelo level. So why even bother? I'm not cut out for this whole artist thing. And you kind of shelve your dream and maybe get out your pencils and draw every now and again, but you don't really allow yourself to experiment or allow yourself to truly be creative and not judge what you're producing. So that is one example of how these beliefs that run on autopilot as an underpinning of everything we do can really affect us long term. And yeah, maybe if you decide not to pursue a career in art, if that's your bag, maybe that doesn't ruin your life. Maybe you go on to have a very nice and satisfactory life, but it certainly can stunt our potential for creative expression. And as one example. So, where do these unhelpful or toxic beliefs come from anyway? Because children are certainly not born believing that they're less than someone else. They're not born believing that they're inherently not good at something. Actually, children have, to the contrary, a very healthy ego development. So they naturally, with the stages of development that Piaget identified, they naturally are very egocentric in the very young years, especially where the whole world revolves around them. They relate everything in their small and growing worlds back to themselves. And that's entirely natural. There's nothing wrong with that. That's a normal developmental stage. And so young children will have this adorably overinflated sense of what they can do at times. They're utterly confident, typically, right? Oh, yeah, I'm going to be an astronaut when I grow up, or yes, I'm going to be an artist, or I'm going to do all these things. And not that it has to be about career, but we often ask children what they want to be when they grow up. So I think that's the most kind of easy example to pull from. But children naturally will gravitate towards an interest or passion and they will do it. They won't spend time worrying about, oh, am I good enough to do this? Are people going to judge me if I follow this passion of wanting to dig up dinosaur bones in the backyard? They don't think about any of those things. They just follow the desire and they go do it. And most of us lose that quite a bit by the time we're adults. I'd say even sooner for most of us, likely by middle school or by high school, when we've really gotten firmly entrenched into these beliefs about what we can and cannot do, who we are and who we are not. And part of this is also normal development. So as we get older and we move through those different developmental stages, we're learning our place in the world. We're learning where we fit in with our social groups, with our families. We're learning important life lessons about how to function in society as a whole, and in this society that we've decided is normative and expectable, and how we should conduct ourselves to be a member of society. So all of those are good things. They're not inherently bad. Sure, you might have some issues with how society runs. That's maybe a whole other topic for another day. But children deciding where they fit in with the world is not in itself a bad or a wrong thing. Where things tend to go awry is when we internalize these examples, and some would call them schemas. When we internalize these schemas, these working models of how we are, who we are, what our roles are in our family, what type of person that we are. And part of this is the very natural neural pruning that happens as we get older. So when we're babies, we are developing millions of neurons at an extremely rapid rate. The brain is growing and creating new connections all the time. And as we get older, there's a need for some of those branches to prune and just for functionality's sake. And I'm really simplifying here. But as we get older, the neural processes start to prune. And so we start operating within these narrower belief systems about who we are and what our possibilities are. Again, none of this is inherently bad. And where we can start to get off track is where we really are feeling like we are only within these limited roles that society or our families has prescribed for us, that there's no other possibilities. So, where do we get these unhelpful beliefs from, or really any belief about who we are and who we are in our families and society? When it comes back to cultural conditioning, and some would say programming. And again, nothing wrong inherently with having this programming. Part of it is how we can function in society. But there are parts of it that can be incredibly unhelpful, such as if we're getting negative messaging about being too sensitive or being too emotional. Especially if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably someone who is more sensitive. You have a more responsive nervous system. You're more easily tuned in to other people's experiences. And you were likely a more sensitive, perceptive child as well. And a lot of the messages that we get in Western culture specifically about sensitivity are very negative. So, children who have intense feelings and intense experiences where they really are moved by very small things, they're moved by the beauty of a drop of dew on a leaf, for example. They can really be made fun of for those things or be shamed into, oh, you're too sensitive. You shouldn't be that sensitive. Other boys aren't that sensitive. Be a man. You shouldn't cry so much. Things like that that are incredibly damaging to a young psyche. So, part of how this can show up for sensitive people, specifically around sensitivity, is starting to mask who you are, starting to become someone who appears to be either less sensitive or hides their sensitivity for fear of being ostracized. And this can also overlap with other neurodivergences. Certainly, there's autistic masking and also ADHD masking, maybe even to a more extreme degree because of the need for survival, the need for fitting in. This is all extremely understandable, but it certainly has consequences for how we view ourselves and our self image and perception of who we are. So, whether it's helpful or not, society and our families, which is the earliest form of society that we are exposed to as really young children, will start to tell us what our roles are. So, for instance, your role in your family growing up, you probably have a pretty good idea whether you were the black sheep of the family, for example. That's one role, the very typical kind of archetypal role. Whether you were the one who took care of everybody else, you were the nurturer and made people feel better when tensions ran high in the house. That's another archetypal role that a lot of children fall into, where you tend to be the smoother of ruffled feathers. You may have been the high achiever. You may have taken pride in identifying as a big helper to a parent or another caregiver, or you may have felt like the family outcast. There are many types of identities that we can have in families, but these are some typical ones. And these are all ways that we start to interact with the world around us in this initial family setting. And this really informs how we see ourselves as we get to be school age and go into the greater world. We'll usually take those working maps of who we are with us and we'll act accordingly from those. Or sometimes we might push back against them and try to be the opposite of that. So there's nothing wrong inherently with any of these roles either. They can be useful. They're ways for kids to try out who they are and how they're going to show up in society. But where they can be really unhelpful is when we forget who we are outside of those important roles, when we might internalize messages like, oh, no one in our family goes into music. Everyone in our family is a doctor. You have to become a doctor too, because that's just what we do in this family. Those types of messages are very shame filled typically. And you can feel a lot of shame if you deviate from what's expected in your family, or you may self censor yourself from expressing who you really are as your essential self because you feel like your family wouldn't accept you. Whether that's true or not is a different story, but there can be a lot of very legitimate fear. And in some cases, the family will not accept that person for doing their own thing, however that may manifest. Okay, so you have your role in the family, your chosen role, or maybe you have a couple roles that depends on who you're with in the family. Maybe to your parents, you have the helper role, maybe to your siblings, you're the bossy older sibling, for example. So these roles inform us of now how we're going to be in school, and we're often rewarded in childhood and in school for some of these roles. So think high achiever, think helpful, compliant, you don't make a fuss, all of those things that society tells us that we should be, right? So we accumulate these beliefs about ourselves as we move through life, starting in those early years. For instance, with I'm getting praised for helping my parents, so I'm a helper. That's where I derive my sense of self worth from. And moving into school, I'm a high achiever, I'm a straight A student, or I'm getting D's and C's, whatever it may be. This is who I am. And then as you hit the professional world or you start a family, you might start adding other facets of labels or identities to those. As we get older, these roles tend to weave in and out of the beliefs that we have about ourselves. We are internalizing these beliefs about ourselves all the time. Some of them are positive, and some of them are, you guessed it, more toxic. So those might look like, oh, I can't do that. That's not something that I'm allowed to do, or that's not something I'm going to let myself explore, for example. That's not something that someone in my role would do. One sign that these beliefs are at play where they're a little more unhelpful or toxic is if we start feeling envious of someone else's life. And not necessarily about material things that they have, could be if they have, I don't know, a huge yacht or massive following on Instagram, or they're really happy seeming all the time, but typically more what you perceive that is possible or available to them that is not available to you. And there are legitimate ways that this can be true. Certainly, structural racism is a thing. So that's a very real consideration where there are opportunities that are available to people who are white skinned that are not available to other folks. So that's a very real consideration. There's obviously sexism is rampant, misogyny, all those sorts of things as well. But I'm not talking about that specifically. I'm speaking more specifically about when we look at someone else's life and think that they have a quality that we don't, so that they are able to speak their mind more, or that it's possible for them to do something that it isn't possible for us to do, that we would deeply love to do, but won't allow ourselves to do. So maybe again, with that example of wanting to be an artist and canning it, where someone might stop themselves from painting or drawing or doing whatever their other chosen pursuit is because they believe that they're not good enough, and might look at someone else and say, oh, they just have natural raw talent and I don't. If I had that natural raw talent like they do, then I could be painting up a storm. So this then raises the question, why do we think that other people can do these things and that we can't? Why do we believe that there's something missing within ourselves, or that is not enough or not good enough within ourselves? These are all invisible signs of these underpinnings of these unhelpful beliefs. So a lot of these beliefs are running in the background constantly. They're informing our every decision, where they're informing how we live our lives, how we self edit, what we post on Instagram and what we don't, how we present ourselves, how we decide to say one thing and not another. They're constantly getting filtered through speed of light. We're not even aware of these unconscious processes going on, but they're very alive in us a lot of the time, especially if we notice shame or we might be second guessing ourselves. How did I look at that gathering? What did I say? Did I say something dumb? And did I make a fool of myself? These types of things are all clues that these beliefs are operating under the surface. And they're draining your battery often. They're really draining your energy. They're draining your self confidence. And we're not often even aware that they're happening. So, how do we know when these beliefs are active and when they're preventing us from doing something, when they're blocking us? Typically, when we're noticing patterns in our lives, if you're self aware enough to be able to notice, oh, here I am in this situation again. Here I am in this eerily similar pattern that I'm always in. Maybe I always feel like I'm attracting this type of potential partner, or I'm only always a shoe in for this type of job. Those are some more obvious examples, but it could be a more nuanced example as well. Maybe I keep having the same conversation with my mother, for example. These are all ways that we can know that there's an outdated belief that's been activated, and we keep coming back to the same place over and over again, and we feel stuck and we feel frustrated that things aren't moving along. And this is the point where a lot of people get into therapy, quite frankly, because it's not working. It's causing a lot of pain, and we get in our own way, and we're not sure how to get out of our own way. So here's one way to play with this and get beyond seeing yourself in these various roles and only as those roles. So, for instance, for me, that would be only seeing myself as wife and a mom and a business owner and not seeing really the essential me. So, if I say that when I meet you and you say, oh, tell me a little bit about you. And I say, I'm a mom, I'm a wife, and I own my own therapy practice and coaching business for HSPs. That gives you a rough idea, a pretty good idea of what I might do and what my day to day could look like, but it doesn't really tell you about me as a person. So when we can see ourselves beyond those roles, and many of us see ourselves as those roles and not much more, but if we can look beyond and even think imaginatively of who am I without these roles, if all these roles were removed or put on pause tomorrow, who would I be without those roles? Who am I beneath those roles? Because there's an essential self that we all have. It typically shows up more when we're calm, when things are neutral, we're not stressed, we're not rushed, we're not having to react to something. That's typically the time where we'll be most aware of this kind of calmer presence where we can feel more in tune with ourselves at a physical level. We're in our bodies, ideally, that we can be fully present and that we can also observe the thoughts that we're having. So, a lot of people will do this through mindfulness or meditation. This gives you a good taste of who this person is that's you beyond the roles that you have and beyond the beliefs that you have about yourself, some of which are probably really helpful and some of which we're focusing on today are more unhelpful or even toxic to you. So when we wind this back, we can think about what are the things in childhood that we really loved doing. Could be a specific activity, could be something more general, a feeling that we really found joy in, or maybe we really loved being in nature. We often will be much more our unedited selves in early childhood. So if we can tap back into what were the things that lit us up? Was it being really creative with words or with art? Did we really love making something for someone? Did we really love spending quality time with someone? These will help us point us more towards what our essential self is like, the qualities that we have when we look beyond all the roles, which again are typically good roles. There's nothing wrong with them. I'm certainly not saying that we should get rid of them, but there can be a lot of these kind of limiting beliefs attached to how we see ourselves in the world. We're not seeing ourselves as a full person that has a spirit and, depending on your beliefs, has a soul that has qualities that are not able to be defined by your roles. So, when we can tap back into that essential self via looking at what we enjoyed doing as young children, was it something that was being an explorer in some way? Was it something that was creative expression in some way, or researching a topic? What really lit you up in general? Then you can start to bring that into your current day life of how can I bring this element of discovery or freedom or joy or creative expression, whatever that may be, into my life today. And that can really help us start to identify when some of these toxic beliefs are coming online because we can start to notice that our physical state will change. There's a huge difference when we're in flow, when we're doing something that we really enjoy and that makes us feel fulfilled, even if it's a hobby or a passion project. These are all worthy things. There's a very different way that we feel physically when we're doing those things as compared to when we are caught up in a negative or limiting belief about ourselves. We'll typically feel anxiety, maybe physical heaviness. We might see kind of constriction in our throat or another part of the body. There are very different physical states that are associated with these different beliefs that we have about ourselves. So, when you can identify what it feels like to be more in touch with your essential self, the parts of you that are always there all the time, no matter what role you're in, no matter what you believe about yourself, then we can identify more when these unhelpful beliefs are coming online because they feel so physically different. They might feel heavier, for instance. And then we know, oh, a belief has been activated. I am believing, for instance, that it's good for that person to go up and give a talk to this group of people. But even though I have professional qualifications that are technically equal to theirs, that I could never do that, for example. That's a situation where we would know one of those toxic beliefs, limiting beliefs, has been activated. And this is a time to really show ourselves some compassion, going, okay, I think that. I'm noticing that I believe this about myself, but is it really true? What's different about them than me? And you can humor your ego a little bit. You can humor the parts of yourself that really are logical and want to give you some very good reasons why it's true that, that person is the next Brene Brown and you're not. I don't speak from personal experience at all. Just kidding. I totally am. Obviously. So, this is when we know that a belief has been triggered, and we can humor that ego by going along and playing along, going, okay, so how do you know that? Uh huh. Okay, sure. They've got more than you here. They've written a book, whatever it is. Doesn't make them worthier to be of service to people than it does to you. And it doesn't have to look the same for you. So we can then start to gently push back on those limiting beliefs that are telling us this is why you can't do that. And there's a good reason why we've had these limiting beliefs or schemas about ourselves. They've served a good purpose. They're often ways that we survived as children because we were accepted within those roles that we had within our family, within school, or within maybe a faith organization that we were involved in. These are all ways that we found acceptance as children and love, which are the primary needs of children. So we do whatever we will have to. We believe and contort ourselves into whoever we have to be to survive as children. And there is nothing wrong with that. It's a brilliant survival strategy, and it may be unhelpful and not supportive to you now in your adult life. So that's why we might want to explore some of these unhelpful beliefs that may date to way back when and just aren't useful or relevant anymore and stopping you from what you'd like to do now with your life. Another way to think about this is while we're not trying to get rid of the roles that we have in society, how can you more fully express your authentic or essential self within those roles? So once you start to tap into those things that maybe you've always loved doing, you just have fallen off of them. Maybe you loved cooking as a child and you just haven't done that lately, but it would be really fun to reconnect with that. Maybe you start to think about how you can bring more of that essential self energy into the various roles that you have. How can you just flex just a little bit so that you're feeling like you're more you in those roles and able to tap more into that most deep and authentic version of you? We also can go at this a couple different ways. We can do this by changing our thoughts and actions, and that will change the energy of how we're interacting with ourselves and other people, or we can change the energy first, and that will then influence the thoughts and behaviors from there. So, one intervention that I really love for unhelpful beliefs or just outdated beliefs is EFT, emotional freedom techniques. And that's something that all over the place online, you can find some very good resources for that. But that's simply where you are tapping acupressure meridians while working on the specific beliefs that you have or the specific experience that you're having in the moment. That's very useful because it can help disrupted energy circuitry. And what we know from Dan Siegel's prodigious work on neuroscience is that the mind meets the flow of information and energy, and it regulates that. So we know that from neuroscience. We also know that from acupuncture, the Chinese medicine system of meridians and energy flow, chi or prana. And we also know that from Western science, in that, for instance, we are semiconductors, the largest organ on our skin, all taken together. It's been well established in Western science that we have energy flowing all the time, again, with the brain and energetic and electric things that are flowing there. We're electrical. So, with energy psychology interventions like EFT, emotional freedom techniques, what we can do is we can reinstate and reconnect that disrupted flow of energy created by the neural networks that we might have about ourselves, where certain synapses are firing together. They say the neurons that wire together fire together. So, we can help to reconsolidate those memories and understand them in a different way, understand our beliefs about ourselves in a different way by starting with the energy first. Sometimes that can be more direct for people, but they're both valid ways of approaching this, either by changing our behavior, acting as if until it happens. You're believing that you can't speak on stage and you just keep doing it until you feel less anxious. That's a time honored tradition of way of doing this. Another way of doing it by starting with the energy first would be to do EFT tapping, again with those meridian points on the face, if you're familiar with EFT, and do the protocol for EFT based around the fear of public speaking. So, when we start to identify these unhelpful and toxic beliefs that we have about ourselves, it can really free up a lot of energy that's draining in the background. If we have too many apps up on our phone and it's just draining the battery, and we're wondering, why is my phone always half 10 all the time? It's because these apps are running in the background. And it's similar with these beliefs, they are constantly running, they're constantly affecting how we engage with the world, and they are often stopping us or inhibiting us from living in a way that we actually would like to be expressing ourselves. So, I hope that this is helpful for you and gives you some new ideas on how you might begin to start to notice what these beliefs are, start to explore what are your roles in your family of origin and society, and how is that impacting you today in terms of how you're living your life and how it might compare to how you might like to be living your life instead? That's our show for today on sensitivity sessions. I'm your host, Stephanie Gardner-Wright. Thanks so much for joining me. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review. And I will talk to you on the next time of sensitivity sessions. Bye for now.